For the fight against extremism and intolerance and sectarianism and chauvinism are of a piece with the fight against authoritarianism and nationalist aggression. If the scope of freedom and respect for the rule of law shrinks around the world, the likelihood of war within and between nations increases. And our own freedoms will eventually be threatened.
In his farewell address, President Obama warned the world about the dangers of fierce nationalism like the kind that fueled Donald Trump's campaign. And world leaders are also expressing their concerns about the fate of long-standing U.S. alliances with Trump in the White House. On Thursday, German Chancellor Angela Merkel said, "From the point of view of some of our traditional partners, and I am thinking here about the transatlantic relations, there is no eternal guarantee for a close cooperation with us Europeans." EJ and David and Douglas are back with me, and joining the table now, Nayyera Haq, former State Department spokesperson and White House senior director. And Nayyera, thank you and welcome to the table. I want to read you what Barack Obama said were his 5 foreign policy goals. He gave a big speech during the campaign in July of 2008. This is what he laid out: end the Iraq war responsibly. We know he ran on that. Finish the fight against al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Secure nuclear materials from terrorists. Provide true energy security and rebuild alliances. How do you think he did, and what do you think is his big foreign policy legacy?
Well, he certainly took out Osama bin Laden, so let's not forget how big a deal that was. And unfortunately, under his tenure, we've also seen the rise of ISIS and extremism at large. And what he's done is used all the tools in the toolbox. It has not been a strictly military response, nor has it been a strictly diplomatic response. And you've seen, for example, when it was necessary to increase the troop count in Afghanistan, did that responsibly. When it's about intelligence sharing to make sure that we're tackling extremist cells, improved that across the country. And the federal budget, less than 1% is foreign aid, and use that in a very smart, targeted way to improve foreign aid and keep those ties, particularly with our allies and countries in the Middle East and South Asia.
Yep. And Doug, for you, what do you think is the biggest foreign policy legacy?
Well, I think you can't get away from that. This administration did effectively dismantle al-Qaeda, did effectively kill Osama bin Laden, did begin some sort of an unwinding of the debacle of Iraq, and I think that you really have to acknowledge that it was a debacle that he inherited. At the same time, it's not at all clear what the principles and the strategy were behind all of this, and I'm not sure that that the world understands exactly what he was trying to do, or really saw him as formidable a figure in the world as a president of the United States really should be perceived as.
Yeah, and I think you probably agree with that last bit.
David. I don't want to call it a legacy because I think this is more about the things the president didn't do than things he did, but I think the most important thing he leaves behind: the dissolution of the European Union, the weakening of NATO, mass migrations across international borders that are discrediting liberal governments in Europe and the United States, and of course the first great power shooting war on the European continent since 1945. Oh, and let's also not forget the weakening of the U.S.-India relationship that once seemed like a potent guarantor of world peace.
You know, and couldn't you argue that the Iraq war was the beginning? Because if you look back at where ISIS came from, it came from the Islamic State in Iran, or it came from the Iraqi insurgency that grew out of the Iraq war. Couldn't you argue that the destabilization of Europe by the devastating situation in the Middle East is really George W. Bush's legacy?
You could argue that if you wanted to make a political point, but not if you wanted to gain an understanding.
But as a factual point, I mean.
Gaining an understanding. No, because what is happening, look, you are having, across West Africa and the Middle East, you're having a Malthusian crisis. That's why these regimes got more and more radical in the first place. That's why people.
But the Iraq war destabilized the region and created it.
No, having vast, doubling the population. In Egypt today, there are 90 million people. When I was born in 1960, there were not even 40 million. At the end of World War II, there were 20 million. They're running out of water. They can't create jobs for all these people. And this is happening across the whole region. It is why tens of millions of people are on the move from Africa and the Middle East into Europe, with the consequences that are destructive of liberal government in Europe. You see a similar thing over here. The political reactions that is breeding are destroying the European Union. They're destroying NATO. They're destroying the whole system of world peace that we've had since 1945.
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating debate. I think we're going to keep having EJ.
I think where I disagree with David is I agree with you that the Iraq war had a lot of destabilizing effects that Obama had to deal with. And I think some of what's happening in Europe are things that the United States could do very little about, although you can argue that the Syria policy has sped up the immigration. Big achievements. I think he really did move closer to Asia, make it more central, and that's going to be important in the long run. I think he actually built on President Bush's engagement with Africa, which we don't talk about enough on either in the case of either presidency. And I think that the American image among a lot of people who didn't like America before he came into office is better. That's not trivial. But the problem with foreign policy is I don't think you can judge it for about 10 years. Because so much of how you look back on Obama will depend on what the world looks like 10 years ago.
You know what's amazing? None of you mentioned two countries, Iran and the nuclear deal, and Cuba. It's interesting that that didn't make the list for anybody as a main foreign policy. But you were going to say
the Iran sanctions in particular, the use of sanctions of this administration has been a very strong tool for leveraging in ways that previous presidents used to use militarily to leverage the constraints you want on a country. And so we have effectively, with the Iran deal, denuclearized Iran for the foreseeable future and no longer an immediate nuclear threat. With Ukraine, when Russia is impeding in Crimea, effectively crippled their economy by bringing the world together on using sanctions. Now, we'll see what the pivot happens with Putin now and how effective that will be, but these were alternatives to being the interventionist, militaristic United States that the rest of the world cannot stand. That's the part that we miss. Domestically, we want to see a strong America that'll stand up for what's right with the military, but it's been the #1 complaint overseas is that the United States is always meddling with military.
And unfortunately, time is always meddling with me. And I'm out of time, so I'm going to have to go to a break. EJ will be back in our next hour. David Frum, thank you so much. Douglas Blackman, it's been so great to have you and Nayyera Haq here. We're going to have you guys all come back, and we'll give each of you a half an hour. That's what